So today we will be discussing the neurobiology of self-obsession. So we will explore this through the lens of mindfulness, including what happens in the brain when we experience our sense of self and how mindfulness practice can affect that process. So there are many discoveries out there that suggest that mindfulness meditation practices seem to train the brain in the direction encouraged by the world's great wisdom traditions. The practices help us shift from focusing on thoughts of improving things for me and instead open to the present moment with acceptance. The mindfulness practice makes us happier and better be able to deal with pain in the process. So the first aspect I would like to bring to our understanding is what we call the default mode network. You may be aware of this or you may not be. So this is the default mode of our brain that appears when our mind is wandering. And this is associated with self-referential processing, or in other words, thinking about me. While our brains evolved primarily to seek opportunities and avoid threats or to sleep, it turns out when we are not doing any of that, our brains are still very active. As when areas of the brain that have been called default mode network comes online. Now, this default mode network include some aspects of the medial prefrontal cortex, so just behind your forehead, and the posterior cingulate cortex, which is slightly in the back side of the brain. And it turns out these meditation practices, mindfulness practice, can dramatically affect the activity of these areas. And this brain activity has been explored by various people in experienced meditators and matched with meditation naive controls, as in people who don't do that much meditation. So they compared experienced versus non-experienced meditators, and they focused this research into 3 skills. So one, concentration. So refocused attention. So as soon as you notice your mind has wandered, you're coming back to what were you doing. Open monitoring, which is basically choiceless awareness, which we have practiced many times, is where we have a sense of understanding of what is going on in our awareness. And loving kindness practice. So these are the 3 skills they focused their research on. They found that the main nodes of this default mode network were relatively deactivated. So default mode network was deactivated in experienced meditators across all these types of meditations. And they believe that the reason for this is that the task common to all 3 meditation techniques is training of attention away from self-reference and mind wandering and towards one's immediate moment-to-moment sensory experience. So in other words, they were being more mindful and they were dissociating themselves from themselves. So that in that way, these experienced meditators were able to interrupt the self-referential thinking or selfing. And also they observed the meditation-specific region differences in activation. For example, during loving-kindness practice, there was deactivation in the amygdala, there are two amygdala, both in one half of your brain, which is the brain structure that's often referenced as the threat detection center, or gets activated or mobilizes things in your brain when we perceive danger. And this makes sense because loving kindness meditation is designed to soothe and comfort. So we might expect that this would help us respond in a neurobiological sense, as though we are not under threat. And to take even further these findings, I think the researchers programmed a computer to analyze in real-time brain activation recorded by this fMRI machines. And they have the computer focus on a particular area of the default mode network called the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, which I'll come back to in a minute, which appears to be most activated by self-referential thinking. So whenever we think about ourselves, if you think, oh, me, I am feeling this, I am doing this, then most likely the PCC is activated. And this is generally deactivated during meditation. So it's a central hub of this default mode network. And the researchers actually decided to draw red upward spikes on a moving graph whenever this area, PCC, of our brain in the default mode network was active, which means that the red spikes indicate that we are thinking about ourselves. And they chose a blue downward spike whenever it was quiet, which means those are the moments where we are not thinking about ourselves. And they put these experienced and novice meditators into these fMRI machines so that the researchers, they could see in real time what happens. And remarkably, subjects were able to see close correlation between what they were experiencing in consciousness in the graph. So that two correlated. Experienced meditators could very quickly silence the PCC or self-referential thinking, while the novice meditators had to struggle a bit more and learn how to do it. And these subjects were amazed at just how closely the graph tracked, whether or not they were involved in self-referential judging thinking. Every time the subject got excited and thought in some way that the computer was really tracking their mind. So this was very interesting for all of us to understand, is how quickly things can move from self-referential thinking to deactivation of self-reference. It doesn't take much time, is the idea. So for a novice meditator or somebody who's just started meditation, as opposed to the experienced one, the graph of the first trial contains almost all red upward spikes, as you can imagine, because as novice meditators, we tend to think about ourselves a lot. When they did a second time, when they were trained a little bit in mindfulness, there was some blue surrounded by red. And in third trial, after another week of mindfulness sessions, the graph started to show a lot more blue downward spikes. And as soon as they finished 4-week trial, it was pretty much all downward lines. And that means in a matter of few short meditation mindfulness practice, we can turn off the self-referential, self-obsessing thinking patterns in our brains. And how wonderful is that with few moments of mindfulness. So initially, these meditators approach the practice as the novice meditators approach the practice as thinking about the breath. So whenever they do the thinking, the breathing practice, just as we did today, thinking about the breath, because they are accustomed to being in that thought stream. And once they understood that it's not just about thinking about the breath, it's just the feeling of the breath. Then suddenly the reference changed. So in normal, when we are living life without meditating or non-meditating life, the default mode network is particularly active during times of rest. So whenever we are sitting idle, not doing much, you tend to see a lot more self-referential or self-obsessing thoughts come up. And this is the reason why this is important to understand, is this default mode network is something we have, all of us have. So whenever we are at work or doing something we love, or being with people who we love, or just enjoying life, or actually even doing chores, even when we sometimes going for a walk, things like that, we sometimes don't actually have that much self-referential thinking. It's only when we slow down, stop, and rest, this processing starts. So, self-referential processing. So, our default mode network plays a central role in creating our sense of self and identity. And also, there is a lot of studies that demonstrate long-term meditators have increased connectivity between regions of the default mode network. So they have a little bit more connections in their brain wiring, mainly because they have been practicing, have been grooving. Several of the studies with experienced meditators have also demonstrated that activity within this default mode network is more tightly coupled with other networks during rest. In particular, networks associated with attention and executive control. So what happens is, when experienced meditators practice a lot of meditation and mindfulness, their default mode network has stronger connections with other areas of the brain which are associated with executive control. So ability to maintain attention, ability to disengage from distraction, and spend less time mind wandering, even when not meditating. And that is very interesting. So even when we are not meditating, you can cultivate this aspect of the brain which helps us stay in the present moment. Now, these findings are the opposite of what is seen in different aspects of life, like autism spectrum and in Alzheimer's disease, in which decreased connectivity within the default mode has been reported. So in these cases, the difference in connectivity are related to clinical symptoms that can lead to difficulty focusing. The fact that meditation experience is associated with the changes of similar magnitude but in the opposite direction of Alzheimer's or autism has implications for the profound nature of changes that may be occurring with meditation practice. So what was the point of all this narrative is to learn about it, because it's fascinating how tiny organ just stuck in our head and connected to the body through the nervous system can have such profound implications in our lives. And secondly, meditation and mindfulness helps alleviate suffering. Suffering created by the self. And this is now backing, so all this research I just mentioned, backs what we already know kind of intuitively through different philosophies, different traditions. Different ancient traditions have been telling us this for aeons. Now, the reason I did a little bit of research is to come home to the point that meditation and mindfulness practices have profound impact in your suffering, in how we associate with suffering. As the age-old adage goes, pain is inevitable, suffering is not. This is actually a reflection of that. And the default mode network is not something which we can influence as much. But with practice, we can help it connect with other aspects of our nervous system. So we can connect our sense of touch, sense of being to the default mode network. So we can connect the feelings and sensations throughout our bodies to the default mode network. So we don't just fall in the trap of this self-reference. So there are two ways we experience the self. First is the narrative focus, which is basically telling stories about ourselves, which is what we are engaged in most of the time, particularly if we haven't trained in a meditation practice. Narrative focus is talking about ourselves, talking to ourselves about ourselves. Experiential focus, which is the other aspect of self-reference, is about the momentary experience. Simply experience mind, body in action. So the experiential self appears to be different from the narrative self-reference. And this is what I mentioned, is derived from different body states. This happens with the activation of an area of the brain called the insula. Now, experiential self-reference, or as they call it, the non-narrative self-reference, or just simply experience, relies on this moment-to-moment proprioception, which is another fancy word of saying feeling what's happening every moment inside and within us. So, another part of the default mode network is the medial prefrontal cortex, which is somewhere here, and its function is linking subjective experiences over time. It holds memories of self-traits or self-things, similar others, reflected self-knowledge, future aspirations. So this is the area of the executive function where they are thinking about what we are doing, what we need to do, what we have to do, and what are our future alignments, etc. So that's the MPFC. And again, researchers found that in novice practitioners or non-meditators, the experiential focus reduced the self-referential activity in the MPFC. In other words, when you start to experience what is going on, you reduce the impact of me or I. And again, this is kind of intuitive, but just to understand in the sense of what is happening within us. And in MBSR, which is like the mindfulness-based stress reduction, graduates who had learned meditation practice, the experiential focus resulted in a marked and pervasive reduction of the activity in the MPFC. So the interpretation is that mindfulness practice teaches us how to decouple from the thought stream and how to be able to shift between the narrative mode or the storytelling me mode to the experiential mode voluntarily. So we can do this instantly, voluntarily. They also found that trait mindfulness is measured by self-report. Together, they suggest that mindfulness yields improved regulation of our emotional responses and help meditators have more equanimity. And there are so many obvious implications for therapy. For instance, not believing in self-narrative is perhaps the most important arena in which not believing in our own thoughts can lead to psychological freedom. So there is this disconnect or dissociation between these two forms of self-awareness. The self across time, accompanied by narratives about me, and the unfolding of moment-to-moment experience, the mind-body. Now, mindfulness practice enables us to see these as separate, to see how the self is created out of a narrative. With mindfulness practice, we learn to differentiate previously inseparable streams in the flow of information in the mind. This ability may help in objectifying the mind, process in which we are able to disidentify from mental activities. And for example, abnormal amygdala function has been consistently demonstrated across several stress-related psychopathologies. In these studies, the short-term 1 to 8 weeks meditation training found decreases in this amygdala activity in response to a variety of affective stimuli, which basically means our threat detection system is in control. So another area of research involves the effect of mindfulness meditation on the experience of pain. Several of these findings have come out of this research, have practical implications how mindfulness meditation can help us deal with all sorts of pain. First, experienced meditators report that they perceive painful stimuli as less unpleasant than inexperienced meditators, with the extent of meditation experience being inversely correlated to unpleasantness rating. So, the same heat or shock feels less unpleasant to the meditators than non-meditators. Secondly, the experienced meditators report higher tendencies to observe and be non-reactive to pain sensations than inexperienced controls. This means that experienced practitioners could simply feel the pain sensations as moment-to-moment sensations without particularly getting upset about them. Third, open monitoring practice results in significant reduction of the pain unpleasantness amongst experienced practitioners, but not novices. Again, this says that it takes some practice with mindfulness meditation for it to have a benefit of reducing subjective discomfort of pain. And finally, the research showed experienced meditators have significant decreases in anticipatory pain anxiety, which means basically the pain of being in pain when in a mindful state, meaning that experienced people don't tense up in anticipation of future pain. This is important because a lot of research shows that this tensing up plays a huge role in what makes pain difficult to bear. So these are just aspects which we can think about when it comes to our own practice. So by accepting pain sensation rather than resisting, fearing, or trying to avoid them, we are able to tolerate greater pain stimulation with less distress, whether the pain is caused by some medical condition or induced in the laboratory. Mindfulness practice decreases suffering and pain-related anxiety through increased processing of the pain sensations themselves. And this is coupled with our idea that involves letting go of attempts to control the sensations. So, as psychologists call it, cognitive disengagement. Now we are seeing on a new biological level how experienced meditators open to pain sensations and apparently feel the pain more vividly while letting go of attempts to control them, and consequently experience less distress or suffering. So what it means is like they feel more pain at the moment of pain, and after they are less distressed and suffering because they don't hold on to that pain. On the other hand, when somebody who has not practiced in mindfulness meditation and the presence of pain stimulus, they have increased activity in all the above mentioned areas because pain is so subjective. It is so entwined with our own narrative self. This is my pain, this is me, this is mine, and that can have this impact. So, and that was just an exploration on the neurobiology of self-obsession. So here are 2 questions you can consider. Maybe just reflecting on what is the default network and what are its implications for understanding how we construct our sense of self. And maybe considering this question, what have the scientists or neurobiologists or the wise ones learned about how experienced meditators experience and react to pain and compare to inexperienced meditators, just as a way of understanding what is possible. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for participating. Appreciate it. And hope that was an interesting insight for you. I'll be back with another chapter soon.